Hello, and welcome to the screencast for Contemporary Moral Issues, College Now, Lehman College, Spring 2020. Today we're going to start a new section in the textbook. It starts on page 444, and it deals with world hunger and poverty. This will be the first part. We'll do the introduction and the first 3 articles, and then our next set of lectures will deal with the last 2 articles in this section. So why should we care? Or why do we care about people who are suffering a lack of their basic needs: food, water, shelter, medical care, safety? They're on the verge of losing their lives. Sometimes it can be hard for us to really personalize the massive amount of suffering in the world. It seems anonymous, it seems abstract or arbitrary. You can even look at what's going on right now with coronavirus. People who can't see any sort of direct line of cause and effect between their actions and the harm that might come to these faceless other people. And sometimes the suffering we're confronted with is in our own lives. We might be suffering severe moral shortages in areas of our lives, or people in our community or our families. Often we hear about it on the news or on the internet, things like natural disasters or war or incredibly repressive governments. So the question is, how much, if any, responsibility do we have to all of these people who are suffering in the world? There's an optimistic way to look at moral progress here on Earth, saying that from the time we were hunter-gatherers, our moral circle of concern has continuously enlarged. Maybe just our family, just our loved ones, just our tribe, all the way out to people on the other side of the planet that have different cultures to us, different races, sexes, religions. So that's one way to look at it. But if we buy into this view that we're all one global community, we have to think about both our rights, their rights, and our responsibilities. What does it mean to be a good person? And if we're going to do this, we have to confront the drastic suffering of others. So the way that our author sets this question up in the introduction, he says, "Are economically advantaged people morally required to participate in a scheme of redistribution so that some of their wealth goes to people who are severely economically disadvantaged? If that's the case, what best explains this obligation?" So all of the articles that we look at, all 5 of them, this is the central question. There are some people that have more than others. And even though we suffer in our daily lives and we struggle to pay our bills and find work, on the whole, our country, where we were born, is a lot better at meeting our basic needs than in some places in the world. We are richer comparatively to billions of people. Timmons, who is again the anthology editor for the textbook that we have, says that the duty of beneficence is central to these questions that he asked. And he defines beneficence as the duty to help those in dire need. And of course, we can always argue about what it means to be in dire need, but there is a common acceptance that human beings need certain things to live. And if they're in danger of not getting those things that they need to live, continue life, they're in dire need. And if we accept that it's our duty to help people in dire need, we need to figure out which people we owe this duty to and how much of our wealth we owe to them. There are, of course, many different ways you can answer these questions, and different moral theories will answer in different ways. We're going to look at a Kantian way of answering the questions, and today we're going to look at 2 consequentialist ways of looking at the answer to these questions. But oddly enough, the two consequentialists that have the main theories for today come to opposite conclusions. Next time, we'll look at one on prima facie duty and, like I said, Kantian moral theory. But first, we'll look at Lifeboat Ethics by Garrett Hardin, Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer, and World Hunger and Moral Obligation by John Arthur. So Lifeboat Ethics starts on page 447. And he gives us two metaphors to think about the world, plus the entire human population on it, and how we might morally proceed to either help or not help the people in this world that are suffering from that lack of very basic needs. Hardin was writing in the mid-1970s, and this was one of the very first times people on Earth had seen these pictures from space showing us how tiny and ultimately fragile our Earth could seem. For most of written human history, we have dominated, we've explored, we've taken natural resources and figured out how to use them and marshal natural resources to do what we want to do with it. The world seems limitless. It seems infinite. There'd always be more places to explore, more natural resources to dominate. Again, in the 1970s, this picture started to change. We see this the next slide, is an updated version of a very famous picture called the pale blue dot. So this is Voyager 1 is a satellite that was launched out to the edges of the solar system. And this is the last picture of Earth it captured. That's Earth. You can see how this might change people's perspectives from thinking that our atmosphere and our environments are boundless to be tamed to something that we have to guard preciously and carefully. But Hardin says this is a bad metaphor for how we should distribute resources on Earth because we don't have one world government. If we had one world government, everybody would have the same rights and responsibilities. We don't, though, so each sovereign nation has the whole of the rights and responsibilities of their population. And when we think about people in dire need, we're only thinking about their rights, and we're not thinking about what those poor countries are responsible for. And if we really think that we have to protect Spaceship Earth, we have to think about our responsibilities as well as our rights. At the beginning of his first section after his introduction, Lifeboat Ethics, he gives some statistics about poverty, which of course are outdated because he was writing in the 70s. So here are some updated statistics about poverty today. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner the amount of people that are living below an American $1.25 a day, and the 1,000, 2,000 is in millions. So what would that be? That would be 1.8 billion people living below $1.25 a day. But modern economists know, or at least have changed their theories to say that wealth isn't the only indicator of a life with basic needs met, because the entire whole of a poor country, you might be able to survive with less money comparatively to a rich country. So they break down other things in the bottom left here. What's the percentage of school enrollment for the entire population under 18? How many years of schooling do they get? Their health is, child mortality is a good indicator of the overall state of the healthcare network, as well as the nutrition in calories that people can get per day. And of course, there's the standard of living section saying, do they have the ability to cook at home? Do they have sanitation available to them? Water, electricity, a non-dirt floor. and the ability to own their own assets. So when you look over to the right, this puts all of that together. The lower light blue color shows that these are the billions of people living under $1.25 a day. But when you consider all of the other factors, the dark blue line is a different indicator to what it means to be living in poverty. And this switches a country like Ethiopia to being mid to low range on the percentage of people living under $1.25 a day. But when you look at the other indices, number of kids enrolled in school, their nutrition, mortality, and basic standard of living, it changes to being a very poor nation indeed. Since Spaceship Earth doesn't work for Hardin, he decided to switch it to another metaphor, the metaphor of the lifeboat. We're not all on one spaceship because we all have different sovereign nations. Each nation is now a lifeboat of its own. And in this thought experiment, Hardin asks you to imagine that the carrying capacity of each lifeboat, or at least our lifeboat, is 50. We have 50 people, and they are going along with their lives, basic needs met. The absolute maximum carrying capacity for this lifeboat is 60, so we have a safety margin of 10. In case of disaster, there's bad weather, we get a leak in the boat, we have this safety barrier in place to help protect us. But then he asks us to imagine 100 people swimming up to our boat. They all want to get on or they want handouts. So what do? If all of these people, without our assistance, will die, they'll drown in the ocean. And Hardin says there are several options. One, we let everybody on. Then there's 150 people. The boat sinks, we all drown. We let 10 on. We no longer have this safety net, so we're just going by, and anytime there's an emergency, we might capsize and all drown. 3, we let nobody on because we have to think about the safety and needs of the people who are already on the lifeboat. 4, we can individually decide to give up our wealth and trade places with somebody who's not on the boat. So he thinks, of course, that the only reasonable choice would be number 3. He discusses next reproduction rates in the world and says that in the so-called developed nations, the rates of birth and death are a lot smaller than in the so-called developing nations. And that if we let everybody in, the original citizens would be outnumbered in mere generations. We'd be swamped. And the carrying capacity, which is an ecological term, would be exceeded. So this is an ecological concept in which, okay, there are a certain number of natural resources here, and there's only a maximum number of people that can use those natural resources before they're degraded or ruined or totally decimated. He says that in addition, if property is held in common for an entire community, you get to the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So the idea is if you own your own land or your own property, you know you have a right to it, but you also know you have the responsibility for upkeep. You're the owner. If you don't take care of your land, no one else will, and it could degrade all on its own. So you take careful care to never get up to this carrying capacity. But when land is held in common, nobody takes responsibility for upkeep. People just use the resources and use the resources and use the resources until they're all gone, they're depleted. And he thinks this is comparable to just letting poor nations take wealth from richer nations. The next section is about world food banks. So there had been an attempt in the 60s and 70s to establish a bank or a storage of food that can be taken out by nations who needed it. And Hardin thinks that this was a direct piece of evidence to support his argument so far, because it's the same wealthy nations giving food and the same poor nations taking food. It's not a bank. People aren't paying anything back. It's just a poorly disguised handout. And this, again, he thinks, is focusing on human rights while neglecting human responsibilities. He says that nations have the responsibility to plan their resource management, and whenever there's an environmental disaster or some other problem with meeting basic needs, they should have this safety net, this ability to dip into their plans and protect people until the crisis has passed. And that if we keep giving handouts whenever there's a crisis, the populations of these poor nations will continue to grow, and the next disaster will be even worse. That's a ratcheting effect. So a ratchet is a tool that you can use to stepwise pick something up or push something down, in addition to being slang. And it's artificial in a sense, because we're using our behavior to reinforce some other behavior or some other event that wouldn't, quote unquote, naturally happen. So he thinks if we stop bailing out poor countries in times of crisis, the population left alone will come back and stabilize to their normal carrying capacity. And this might sound really cold, because when we talk about a normal carrying capacity, we do mean that a lot of people will suffer and likely die. And that's the upshot of his argument, that we shouldn't artificially inflate poor nations' populations because it leads to bigger populations and bigger crises. We have to emphasize responsibility. So now I will put in some criticisms of this argument. Hardin was an ecologist, so he has some expertise about how natural environments can support life and human life. But he does speak as if there is a scientific consensus on the carrying capacity for the entire Earth, or the carrying capacity for each nation, and there is not. He never addresses it. He never makes an argument about it. He just relies on vague notions of handouts and letting people in without ever tackling what the actual carrying capacity of the Earth could possibly be. He also uses a lot of emotional language, which isn't the strongest critical analysis tool. He says that the rulers of poor countries are slovenly, that people are trying to get goodies and handouts, they don't want to work, and you can see that there are all of these underlying assumptions about poor people deserving to be poor underneath his emotional language. And of course, this leaves out many historical forces that are not the fault of poor people, including corrupt governments that they can't control, including colonialism, wherein rich Western nations came in, sacked the resources of poor nations, and then took all the wealth out. U.S. and other Western nation-backed coups of stable governments in poorer nations, as well as other complex economic factors in our globally interdependent world. You should always question unstated assumptions, and the assumption that poor people deserve to be poor is a big assumption, as well as the other side. Do wealthy nations deserve to be wealthy if they did those things like colonialist sacking of resources. So he has this really simple cause and effect assumption that is never argued for. And one final criticism is to think about how we shouldn't distrust experts in the sense that we'll never be able to learn everything all about many different topics in the world with given just one lifetime. It's important that we can reap the rewards of other people's hard intellectual and scientific work. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't critically examine their claims. We, as human beings, often tend to stray outside of our area of expertise. And when somebody talks about moral desert, whether you deserve something or not, you're going a little bit outside of your role as an expert ecologist. The next article that we are going to look at is Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Now, looking at the clock here, I realize this is going a little bit long, so I'm going to split this up into parts 1A and 1B, and I will see you in the next video.